Welcome to the dark corners of your imagination, where nightmares take form and shadows hold secrets. This is Mr. Night's Scares Story, your gateway to the macabre, the unexplained, and the terrifying. Here, we dive deep into the spine-chilling stories that keep you awake at night, true tales of haunted places, unspeakable horrors, and things that go bump in the night. From cursed objects to paranormal encounters, from urban legends to sinister truths, we uncover it all. But beware, these stories have a way of lingering. Once you hear them, they might follow you, whispering in the dark when you're all alone. So, if you dare step into the unknown, subscribe, turn off the lights, and join us as we venture into the shadows. This is Mr. Night's Scares Story, where fear finds you. Story number 1. The Shadow in the Basement. In the forgotten town of Black Hollow, there was a house that stood apart from the rest, a decaying relic of despair known as the Grayson House. Time had eroded its grandeur, leaving behind sagging walls and shattered windows. Its story was whispered only in hushed tones. A family had vanished there decades ago, their fates sealed by an unseen horror. Since then, no one dared to enter. Evelyn Carter, a determined journalist with a taste for the macabre, had heard of the Grayson House through an obscure blog. As an investigator of urban legends and cursed places, she was drawn to Black Hollow like a moth to a flame. Her career thrived on mystery, and the Grayson House promised the ultimate story, a first-hand account of the cursed basement. The locals tried to warn her. Old Mr. Thatcher at the gas station told her to leave while she still could. "That house doesn't just scare people, miss," he said, his voice trembling. "It takes them." Evelyn brushed him off, her curiosity too great to ignore. On a stormy evening, she arrived at the house. Rain lashed against the skeletal trees, and lightning briefly illuminated the imposing structure. She stood at the gate, staring at the cracked stone steps that led to the door. The air seemed unnaturally still, as if the house were holding its breath. "Just a story," she muttered to herself, gripping her flashlight tightly. The door creaked open with little effort, revealing a darkness so thick it seemed alive. Evelyn stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. The smell of damp wood and rot hit her like a wall. Her flashlight swept across the room, revealing dilapidated furniture draped in cobwebs. A tattered family portrait hung above a fireplace, its once vivid colors faded into muted grays. She stepped closer to inspect it. The Graysons, father, mother, 2 children, smiled out of the frame, but something was wrong. The shadows behind them seemed to ripple and stretch, as if they were alive. Evelyn shuddered and turned away, blaming her imagination. She wandered through the house, each room telling a story of abandonment and decay. Broken toys lay scattered in one corner, a toppled dining table in another. But it wasn't until she reached the basement door that she felt true dread. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a staircase descending into pitch-black darkness. A cold draft wafted up, carrying with it a faint whispering sound. Evelyn hesitated, her journalist's instinct warring with the primal urge to run. "This is it," she whispered, switching on her flashlight. "The story of a lifetime." She descended slowly, each step creaking under her weight. The walls were covered in deep scratches, as though something had clawed at them in desperation. Her flashlight flickered, but she pressed on. The whispers grew louder. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a wide, damp basement. Rusted tools hung from the walls, and the floor was slick with a dark, unidentifiable liquid. The whispers seemed to echo from all directions, faint yet distinct. "Evelyn," she froze. It wasn't a hallucination. The voice, raspy and unnatural, was calling her name. Her flashlight flickered again, and that's when she saw it. In the far corner of the basement, shadows seemed to coalesce into a figure. It was human-shaped but featureless, a void darker than the surrounding darkness. It didn't walk. It glided, silent and deliberate. Evelyn stumbled back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The figure stopped. For a moment silence reigned. Then, A cacophony of voices erupted, overlapping and screaming her name. Evelyn screamed as the shadow surged forward, engulfing her in cold, suffocating darkness. She dropped the flashlight, and it shattered, plunging the basement into total blackness. The voices continued, a deafening symphony of malice. Evelyn felt icy fingers wrap around her wrists, her ankles, her throat. She clawed at the darkness, but it was alive, pulling her deeper into the void. When she woke, it was morning. She was lying in the woods several miles from the Grayson house. Her clothes were torn, her hands scratched and bloody. She stumbled into town, her eyes wide with terror. The locals found her and brought her to the hospital. She muttered incoherently about shadows, whispers, and eyes, red, glowing eyes. When she finally calmed enough to speak, her voice was hollow, lifeless. "It's not just the house," she said. "It's the shadows. They're alive and they're hungry." Evelyn left Black Hollow as soon as she was discharged, but the whispers didn't stop. They followed her in her dreams, in the dark corners of her apartment. She tried to tell her story, but no one believed her. And then, one night, she vanished. Her apartment was left untouched, except for a single message scrawled on the wall in a dark, sticky substance. "The shadows have her now." In Black Hollow, the Grayson house still stands, its basement sealed but never empty. Locals claim they can hear faint screams on stormy nights, and the whispers have begun spreading to nearby homes. Story number 2. The Crimson Room. Deep in the countryside, hidden from prying eyes, stood an ancient mansion known as Ravenshade Manor. It was a monument to forgotten grandeur, its walls cloaked in ivy and its windows clouded with decades of grime. Rumor had it that one room within the mansion was cursed, the Crimson Room. No one alive had seen the room and lived to tell the tale, but the story spoke of walls that bled, whispers that drove people mad, and a malevolent presence that hungered for souls. Most dismissed the tales as superstition, but for Marcus Holloway, an aspiring paranormal investigator, it was a challenge he couldn't resist. Marcus arrived at Ravenshade just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the mansion in an eerie twilight. Armed with his camera, audio recorder, and a journal, he pushed open the heavy oak door. The air inside was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic, something he couldn't place. The grand foyer was a labyrinth of decaying opulence. Chandeliers hung by a thread, their crystals dulled by time. Portraits of solemn-faced ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow Marcus as he explored. He knew what he was looking for. According to his research, the Crimson Room was on the second floor at the end of the west wing. As he made his way up the grand staircase, the air grew colder. His flashlight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the peeling wallpaper. At the top of the stairs, a chill ran down his spine. The corridor stretched endlessly before him, the air growing heavier with each step. The doors lining the hall were closed, their brass handles tarnished. But one door at the very end was slightly ajar. The Crimson Room. Marcus hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door, the faint sound of his own breathing the only noise in the suffocating silence. The closer he got, the more palpable the dread became. Pushing the door open, Marcus stepped inside. His flashlight illuminated the room, and his breath caught. The walls were a deep, unnatural red, as though painted in fresh blood. The room was furnished simply. A four-poster bed, a wardrobe, and a large mirror hung opposite the door. He began documenting the space, speaking into his recorder. "The air here feels wrong, heavy. There's a smell, like copper, like blood." As he examined the mirror, he noticed something strange. His reflection was slow to mimic his movements, lagging a second behind. He raised his hand, and the reflection did the same, but its fingers twitched unnaturally, as though they were struggling to obey. Marcus took a step back, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. His reflection didn't move. "Hello," he whispered, his voice trembling. The reflection smiled. Marcus stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the bed and landing hard on the floor. The mirror began to ripple, as though the glass were liquid. The reflection stepped out of the frame, its eyes now black voids that seemed to suck in the light. It stood over him, its face a twisted, malicious version of his own. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice a distorted mockery of his. Marcus scrambled to his feet, grabbing his flashlight as the figure advanced. He swung it wildly, the beam cutting through the darkness but doing nothing to the entity. The walls began to bleed, thick, crimson streams seeping from every crack. The whispers started then, low and insistent, growing louder with every second. "Stay, stay, stay," they chanted, the sound burrowing into his mind. Marcus bolted for the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The entity laughed, a hollow, inhuman sound that echoed around the room. "There's no escape," it hissed. Desperate, Marcus turned to the mirror. The glass now showed scenes of torment. Faces screaming in agony, their mouths stretched impossibly wide. He realized with a sickening jolt that these were the souls of those who had come before him. "I'm not staying here," Marcus screamed, throwing his body against the door. It held firm, as though the house itself refused to let him go. The entity lunged, its hands cold and claw-like as they wrapped around his throat. Marcus gasped for air, his vision darkening as the whispers grew deafening. Just before he blacked out, the last thing he saw was his own face in the mirror, staring back at him with a sinister grin. Days later, a group of hikers found Marcus's abandoned car on a dirt road near Ravenshade Manor. The police investigated, but Marcus was never found. Back at the manor, the Crimson Room was quiet once more. The mirror stood undisturbed, its surface smooth and unbroken. But if you looked closely, you might see a new face trapped within the glass. A face twisted in terror, silently screaming for release. Story number 3. The Whispering Forest. In the remote village of Eldergrove, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly, no one ventured into the Whispering Forest after sunset. The villagers whispered of eerie voices that called your name, luring you deeper until you were never seen again. For years, stories circulated about the forest. People spoke of lost souls, shadows that moved without light, and creatures with glowing eyes that watched from the darkness. But one tale was the most chilling of all, that of the Wailing Woman. They said she had once been a villager, a healer accused of witchcraft centuries ago. When the townsfolk tied her to a tree in the heart of the forest and left her to die, her screams cursed the woods. Now, she hunted anyone foolish enough to wander into her domain, driven by an eternal hunger for vengeance. Isaac was new to Eldergrove, a skeptical outsider. A travel writer with a flair for debunking myths, he scoffed at the villagers' superstitions. One evening, over drinks at the local tavern, he boldly announced his plan to explore the forest. "You'll regret it," an old man warned, his voice trembling. "The forest doesn't just take people. It changes them." Isaac laughed it off. "Don't worry. I'll write the truth and prove there's nothing to fear." The next evening, armed with his camera, flashlight, and a notebook, Isaac entered the forest. The sun was setting, casting the woods in a golden haze. At first, it seemed peaceful, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Birds chirped overhead, and the crunch of leaves under his boots was the only sound. But as night fell, the forest changed. The air grew colder, heavier, as though the trees were pressing in on him. The birds fell silent, replaced by faint whispers carried on the wind. Isaac froze, straining to listen. "Isaac!" He turned sharply, his flashlight sweeping the trees. "Who's there?" he called, his voice echoing. No answer came, but the whispers continued, soft and insistent. His name repeated over and over, sometimes close, sometimes distant. A chill crept up his spine. He told himself it was just the wind, but his hands shook as he gripped the flashlight tighter. He glanced at his watch. It was nearly midnight. He decided it was time to turn back, but the path he'd been following was gone. Panic bubbled up as he turned in circles, trying to find his bearings. The trees seemed to have shifted, closing in on him. The whispers grew louder, now joined by faint sobbing. "Help me!" The voice was that of a woman, fragile and broken. Against his better judgment, Isaac followed the sound. The sobbing led him deeper into the forest until he stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an ancient tree, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Beneath it knelt a figure, a woman dressed in tattered, filthy clothing. Her hair was matted, and her back was turned to him. "Miss, are you all right?" Isaac asked, stepping closer. The woman stopped sobbing and went still. Slowly, she began to turn. Isaac's heart plummeted as her face came into view. Her eyes were hollow voids, black as the abyss. Her skin was pale and cracked, as if it were made of brittle porcelain. When she opened her mouth, it stretched impossibly wide, a guttural wail escaping that shook the very ground. Isaac stumbled back, tripping over a root. The whispers exploded into a cacophony, voices screaming, laughing, and sobbing all at once. The woman began to crawl toward him, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with tangled strings. Desperate, Isaac scrambled to his feet and ran. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at his clothes, roots tangling his feet. No matter how far he ran, the whispers followed, growing louder with each step. Finally, he saw a faint light ahead. With a burst of adrenaline, he broke through the tree-line and collapsed onto the grass. The villagers found him hours later, trembling and incoherent. He tried to explain what he had seen, but no one believed him. The old man at the tavern simply shook his head. "You're lucky you escaped. Most don't." Isaac left Eldergrove the next day, vowing never to return. But the forest wasn't finished with him. In his dreams, the wailing woman appeared, her hollow eyes staring through him, her whispers filling his mind. Each night, she came closer, her outstretched hands reaching for him. A month later, Isaac disappeared. His last article, unfinished, was found on his desk. It ended with a chilling note. "The whispers never stop. She's coming for me." Back in Eldergrove, the villagers whispered of Isaac's fate. Some claimed they saw his shadow moving among the trees, his voice joining the others that called out from the whispering forest, warning the next curious soul to stay away.